All right, so today we're going to start with the quadrilaterals unit. So just real quick, quadrilaterals are four-sided shapes. All of the sides are straight sides, and we're going to be talking about specific kinds of quadrilaterals over the next week and a half, starting with our parallelogram, moving on to then a rectangle, rhombus, and square, and then we'll finish up talking about trapezoids and kites. So here are a few of the properties that we're going to talk about with a parallelogram. So again, a parallelogram is a quadrilateral, meaning it has four sides. With a parallelogram, we know that the opposite sides are parallel to each other. Now this is something that we want to know, but we're not going to do any tests or anything like that for. So we're going to focus in on a few other properties, but just know that parallelogram means that we have opposite sides being parallel. Opposite sides are also congruent. Now remember, when I'm talking about opposite sides, I'm talking about the sides across from each other. Okay, so if you look here, the sides I highlighted in yellow are opposite each other, and the sides I highlighted in green are opposite each other. So if we look at this example here, side ED is congruent to side FC. We would also know that side EF is congruent to side DC. All right, so those opposite sides are congruent. Now remember, when we're talking about congruent, that means they're equal to each other. So we're going to set each of the sides equal to each other. So let's focus in on the two sides we have values for, so ED and FC. All right, so we have one side is 23, and that's equal to the other side, which is 24x minus 1. Now we're going to solve this algebraic equation to get the value of x. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides. So I have 24x on the right equals 24. I'm going to divide by 24, and I get x equals 1. All right, so again, a reminder, opposite sides are congruent. So when we have values for those opposite sides, we set them equal to each other. The next property we're going to talk about are opposite angles. Those are also congruent. So opposite angles are, think of them as like diagonally across from each other. So for example, this angle and this angle are congruent because those are opposite. They're across from each other, like that. We have another set of opposite angles. It would be H and F. We don't have values for those, so we don't need to worry about them, but those are also opposite to each other. So remember, if things are congruent, they're equal to each other. So we're going to take the congruent angles and set them equal to each other. So I have this angle here, 24x, equals this angle here, 48. All right, now I'm going to solve for x. So I'm going to divide both sides by 24. I get x equals 2. All right, and that's my answer there. I'm going to highlight those. All right, and then lastly, we're going to talk about consecutive angles. So consecutive, think about when we talked about the parallel lines last week and those angle pairs. We had consecutive interior. Consecutive, remember, means right next to each other. So consecutive angles are supplementary, which means they equal 180 when we add them together. And that's how I have this little formula here. Okay, so I have one angle plus the other angle equals 180. So again, supplementary is right next to each other. So an example of supplementary angles in this case is angle G and H. They are right next to each other. We could also have angles H and E would be supplementary because they'd be consecutive, one right after the other. E and F would be supplementary because they'd be consecutive. And we'd also could say F and G are consecutive. All right, so it all just depends on how you're looking at this. There are just many different pairs of supplementary angles, consecutive angles that we could have. But here we're focusing in on these two angles. And since they're right next to each other, they're not diagonal from each other, we know that when we add them together, we can set them equal to 180 because they will be supplementary. So I'm going to set up 7x plus 2 plus 136 equals 180. So I'm going to start by combining my like terms. So I have 7x plus, I'm going to add these two together, 138 equals 180. All right, now I'm going to subtract my 138 from both sides. That leaves me with 7x equals 42. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 7. So x equals 6. So again, we have 3 different properties we're going to be looking at with these parallelograms and we're going to be solving for. Opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent, and consecutive angles, those right next to each other, are supplementary, means equals to 180. All right, and we're going to take a moment here. We're going to solve for these 3 problems. So first you want to figure out what situation do we have here. So I'm going to take a look, and I see we're talking about angles. Now I want us to decide, are they opposite angles? Are they diagonal from each other? Or are they right next to each other? So one angle next to the other angle, all right? And that's what I have here. I have one angle and then the next angle. I have values for those angles. So those angles together are consecutive. Remember, that means right after the other. Okay, there's no space, no angles in between that we're missing. So since they're consecutive, that means they're supplementary. So we're going to use this format here. One angle plus the other angle equals 180. All right, so let's set that up. We have 15x plus 60 equals 180. I'm going to then subtract my 60 from both sides. I have 15x equals 120. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 15. So I get x equals 8. All right, with this next one, I see I'm talking about angles as well, but this time they're diagonal from each other. All right, so we call that opposite. And for the opposite, that means we have one angle equals another angle because they're congruent. So they're equal to each other. So I'm going to set up 33x equals 66. So I have my one angle equals my other angle. Now remember, it doesn't matter which side of the equal sign you put things on. I could set this up as 66 equals 33x. It means the same thing. Okay? So as long as we're setting it up with the equal sign in between. So now I'm going to go through, I'm going to divide by 33. And then I get x equals 66 divided by 33 is 2. All right, and lastly, we're looking at these sides. And now opposite sides, so directly across from each other. Remember, those are congruent. So opposite sides are congruent. So we have side equals the other side. So x plus 7 equals 2x plus 3. All right, so I'm going to go through and solve to get the x by itself. Now I have x's on both sides. Remember, it doesn't matter which side I move my x's over to. So I'm going to move them over to the right because I see that will give me a positive x to work with. So we have a positive 1x here, so I'm going to subtract x on both sides. So that leaves me with 7 equals 2 minus 1x will give me x, or 1x, plus 3. Now I'm going to subtract 3 on both sides. So I get x equals 7 minus 3 will give me 4. All right, so those are the 3 properties we're going to focus on here with our parallelograms. So again, consecutive angles, so angles right next to each other, all right, one right after the other. Those are supplementary, so equal to 180. Opposite angles are congruent to each other, and opposite sides are congruent to each other. So both of those, we take the values and we set them equal to each other.